I know, I am preemptively jinxing myself. I know that possibly, very likely by Friday, we will have to have an updated video where all of this will be worthless, but it's interesting that so far we have gotten now into the second reset of 11.1 of Season 2, and we have yet to see any meaningful balance tuning when it comes to specs, when it comes to the balancing, the performance of DPS healers and tanks in this season, even after, of course, this was the reset where the Race to World First has ended. We already have gotten 3 guilds killing the last boss, and that's usually where you would think that Blizzard is like, okay, we are now free to send some changes to specs and classes now that they will not be interfering with the guilds competing for first kills. However, what we have gotten for today though is the other side of the coin, which is Blizzard being very active in nerfing, very active in adjusting not just the raid bosses but also Mythic Plus dungeons. We have gotten quite the nice carpet bomb of nerfs since the beginning of the season to many of the annoyances in Mythic Plus, and now we have also gotten some in the raid. Starting with the changes given to Mythic Plus, we have Cinderbrew Meadery. We have a very good... Last time we looked at the nerfs of Meadery, we were kind of disappointed. There wasn't really that much that was actually going to make the key that much easier. This time there will be though, quite a few of them. Because finally, we are now getting rid of Chef Chewie's compliments to the Chef aura. TLDR, the aura that stopped you from pulling Chewie with any other of the dangerous mobs most of the time, because it would stop mobs from being crowd controlled. This aura is now gone, which means you can now pull Chewie together with a bunch of other packs. This will still be quite deadly because, as you know, Chewie still does his knockback AoE, which is quite a lot of damage still, so it's still dangerous to pull them together with other packs, but at least now you can. To begin with, it's not nearly as suicidal as it was before, which is very good. Also, talking about the damage in this first room of Cinderbrew Meadery, the hired muscle, so the second major AoE damage you had to fear in that room, the volatile keg damage, the 8-second dot of the hired muscle, it has been reduced to 6-second dot instead of an 8-second dot. Then you have boss nerfs, because you have Bank Busby's Honey Marinade explosion damage reduced by 48%, so the circle that then spawns the lava that you should be putting in the corners of the room has been reduced by 48%, and then the other quite dangerous mechanic on IPA, or playing along with the pun of being a beer boss IPA, Burning Fermentation. So the double magical damage dot, which hurts a lot. It's quite visible how out of tune that was compared to other dots in this dungeon, but also in other dungeons. This dot has been reduced by 20% in damage. So it is again more manageable for this boss as well. So Cinderbrew Meadery finally gets actually a significant round of tuning to 2 different bosses, as well as the first room of the dungeon, which was one of the more dangerous moments for your trash count in that place. Then we have Darkflame Cleft. Now, Darkflame Cleft, and you have to be honest with yourself, was the easiest of the dungeons. Yes, it seemed like most groups ended up failing within the first 2 packs of the dungeon because they do not understand how a couple of the mobs in there work, namely the lowly mole herd throwing rocks around and the royal weaklighter doing a whole bunch of damage from range, not being grouped together, left free in the back, hitting players. That was one of the more dangerous parts of the dungeon that came right there at the beginning. But after that, though, the dungeon was sort of a breeze. There were very few trash pulls. You went very quickly, especially once you reached the first boss. It was literally 3 packs before the second boss, and then 2 more packs before the third boss, and then you had the whole cart event before reaching the last boss. So it was a very quick dungeon with a very lenient timer. Getting to 10 to 15 deaths in a 12 and still timing Darkflame Cleft was a possible thing. So the first change, which is obviously a nerf to the dungeon, is that the timer goes from 33 to 31 minutes to account for how wide the timer is compared to the amount of stuff you have to do in there, which is not much. But there is a very good QOL at the very least. Tanks will be rejoicing, especially tanks without too many ways to actually deal with this, which is the corridor creeper's creeping shadow. So tanks had to learn the hard way. Once they go in there, they casually pull a couple of these corridor creepers and they realize they get this dot on them that starts stacking and then stacking and then stacking over and over until they just can't handle it anymore. What's even worse is that, of course, once you are doing the cart event, if you leave the flight and you don't hold the light yourself, you can't do anything. You can't even heal yourself because you do 99% reduced damage and healing, so tanks couldn't even kite away from the cart in the shadows to try to get rid of this dot ticking on them because they couldn't even be healed while they were doing that. So this was a big problem. You could of course deal with it. Vengeance Demon Hunters or Warriors could leap away. You could have a Priest grip you or an Evoker rescue you away. A tank Paladin could alternate Divine Shield with Spell Warding to have the stacks drop. But it was still very annoying, and more or less tanks would always die once or twice whenever you had to deal with these creepers. So the change is that now you get 2 minutes less on your timer, but now these mobs become somewhat of a non-issue. Now you can happily pull 3 of them at once, dispel on cooldown on your healer, and the tank should be fine when fighting these creepers in Darkflame Cleft. And it should still remain one of the easier dungeons still, despite this 2-minute nerf on the timer. Now, the other change is a nerf to Floodgate, which has already been one of the more targeted dungeons for nerfs, which is, the first one is the classic, whenever we wonder why is Blizzard nerfing the damage of one-shots, if they are still one-shots anyways. Well, perhaps this has to do with the scaling for Heroic and Mythic 0 difficulty, more so than Mythic Plus, where these things don't one-shot you quite yet, which is the Swamp Face Mudslide damage. Mudslide isn't the ticking AoE, isn't the ticking AoE he does during the explosion of the waves. Mudslide is the frontal. It's the big frontal you're supposed to be dodging, and now it does 25% less damage. It's still gonna one-shot you if you get hit by this frontal, and rightfully so. You shouldn't survive that frontal. Now, at the very least, the one after Swamp Face does get nerfed, because Bubble's Backwash initial impact damage has been reduced by 20%. Now, the initial damage is not nearly as dangerous as the actual dot that follows, but it does help. Especially because this mob comes right after Swamp Face, which is a tough boss, so you might be already running low on your defensives, on your healer cooldowns to survive this AoE damage, and then you have to deal with this mob right after Swamp Face, so it was kind of rough to go through, and now it is slightly nerfed in the amount of damage it does for Floodgate. There's also been a nerf to the difficulty of Priory, although this one is quite simple. Instead of having a 30-minute timer, now Priory has a 32.30 seconds timer. So 90 more seconds worth of timer in the Priory. That's it. You also have Baron Bromepike, the second boss, using his abilities more in a consistent order. It was kind of annoying with his spell queuing, whether or not he was actually ending up using his channel, his blaze, or waiting a bit and then waiting and then waiting. It was kind of annoying, especially for healers, to prep up the healing required for that damage. But it wasn't a particularly difficult boss anyways. It's more relevant to have the 90-second larger timer in the Priory. It has already received quite a bunch of nerfs to the difficulty, mostly of the trash in this dungeon, and now you have a larger timer in the Priory. So it's also very good. Those were the 4 dungeons particularly targeted by this latest round of tuning at this reset. As we have been going live now in this new reset of patch 11.1, these are all already live. What has been even larger, of course, has been the multiple sets of changes and nerfs to what we touched on when we had our video about the difficulty of the raid, the 2 mid-bosses, Stix Bunkjunker and Sprocketmonger Lock-and-Stock. We mentioned initially we thought this could have been the hardest raid ever based on the deaths, based on the progress of guilds in these 2 bosses, which was super low, the lowest ever on modern raids in the past almost a decade of raids. It was the lowest ever for these bosses this early into the raid, and then like 3 days later the last boss died in like 100 pulls. So it was kind of conflicting evidence there, but these 2 bosses were still super tough, and they have been also super nerfed. That's all there is to it. So, Stix Bunkjunker already received 3 different hotfixes midweek. Last week they had the boss's HP reduced, all of the territorial bombshells health reduced by 10%, and then now they unroot themselves at 80% HP instead of 75%. They reduced the damage of the accidental, secondary damage like the rocket damage by 33% by the Scrap Masters. And now in this reset they were like, those were only appetizers, those were just to get a few guilds through the boss, the guilds that were already close to the kill. But now though, in this reset we land the hammer, the ban hammer on this boss. So, electromagnetic sorting damage, which is the AoE that does most of the raid-wide damage every minute or so, has been nerfed by 20%. You now have 4 more seconds to be on your rolling ball, to have more time to pick up your trash and send your ball in the bomb or on the boss. You have the Scrap Master's Recycler, so the very dangerous single target one-shot basically, takes now 14 seconds to channel instead of 10 seconds, so you have more room to either interrupt it or to just stop it with your balls. Now, Territorial Bombshell not only had its health reduced by 10% already, now it has an extra 16% health reduced on this ad. On top of this, less annoying to have the hyenas move and run around and bite people to put a disease on them to reduce the healing received. Now this has been reduced by 10%, as well as less damage by the hyenas actually biting people by 33%. This is now a much more manageable boss. Of course, this was also going on along with every weekly reset. So this reset, we are talking about another likely mid-track 675 plus item level gear from your vault, another 675 from your second craft. Then you're also getting the buff of your second embellishment being completed, as well as this week being the week where you get the 3% more damage and healing from the raid, your stacking raid buff, as well as another week worth of re-clear for more gear. That was also practically a passive nerf to the raid, where most of your group will be buffed by 8 to 9% overall in damage and healing this week, on top of all of the nerfs to Stix. Then though, there was an even bigger problem. If Stix was a problem, then Sprocketmonger would have been even worse, because it was, and still is, a harder boss than Stix. So it has received a large amount of nerfs as well. This time Blizzard didn't even bother nerfing Sprocket midweek, simply because there were like 8-9 guilds working on this boss until a few days ago. Now, there are some leftover nerfs in here, like the polarization generator damage, which is when you get your polarity signs, the plus and the minus, the positive and negative. Not really relevant. You also have the polarization blast damage nerf reduced by 30% and 25% in Mythic. This is when you bump onto someone of the wrong polarity. Again, it's not supposed to happen, it's not that relevant. What is way more relevant is the nerf to the unstable explosion, which is the ticking damage of your mines, which is a very dangerous part of the fight in terms of damage taken. This is nerfed by 17.5%, and more importantly, the rocket barrage damage has been reduced by 25%, the void splash damage has been reduced by 33%, and the number of rockets actually spawned has been reduced by 20%, and the number of void orbs that actually spawn for void barrage has been reduced by 29%. So this is basically all about dodging. The dodging of the rockets and the dodging of the void orbs, which were two of the more problematic single target one-shot moments, which were also required coordination of having like a hunter with turtle stand in the back of the raid to protect the raid from the rockets coming with his immunity, for example. Now it's much less deadly. For example, a completely unmitigated hit from the rocket barrage used to do 8 million damage. Even if you add, Avantus rune, some verse on your gear, it will go down to like 7-ish million damage, which is almost a one-shot. Almost a one-shot. And don't forget all of the picking damage, the mines exploding, happening in the fight. So taking a 7 million hit was almost certain death very often. However, with this, for example, 25% nerf on this rocket, then the hit would go down to about 5.5 million damage. which is now much more survivable. You're much less at risk of getting one shot if you're hit by the rocket barrage and by the void orbs. You have now less HP on the boss, less damage from the mines exploding, and less damage on your single target oopsies of getting hit by the rockets and by the orbs on this boss. Unlikely we'll see any major nerfs on one-arm bandit. It will likely we'll see some on Magzi, but Blizzard is perhaps expecting guilds to get the big brunt of the guilds to get on Magzi in like 2 weeks. So more gear, the raid buff stacking, even more gear. Maybe they expect the boss to become a bit easier by then. But these were definitely the two bigger outliers in terms of difficulty curve at the beginning of the raid, Stix and Sprocket so far. So correct targeting of nerfs from Blizzard in the raid. Now, of course, as we go through the changes in Mythic Plus and the changes in the raid, it is still unique that we haven't really seen any sort of balance tuning when it comes to specs and classes. Perhaps it's easier, of course, to target nerfs on dungeons and raids rather than having the time to analyze the data of all of the specs in the raid or even in Mythic Plus and come to a quick solution. It's definitely easier to do so in a dungeon or in a raid. So we might be having to wait a bit longer. As I said, I might have jinxed this video by pointing this out, because then now that I did, very likely by Friday before the weekend we will have the announcement of Blizzard of the balance tuning plan to hit, or maybe by next Tuesday. By next reset is when we will get, at the very latest, very likely, the set of changes intended for specs and classes. But for today, this was all that happened in the weekly reset when it comes to balancing. No specs, no classes, no meta whatsoever, just dungeons and raids. So, with this out of the way on this Wednesday, we've got stuff to do on the weekly reset, so it's time to leave each other. Thanks, of course, as usual, guys, for having watched the video, together with, of course, everyone else who's been supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, yeah, we are quite busy now. We have about 4 hours to do several different things, and I haven't even changed after I came home.